Yo, what's going on guys, Jin here. This is another build guide, this time for Lash. It's not a meta build for sure, but it's a nice change and can still clear 90 plus pits, and it's pretty fun to play. If you like this kind of guide, consider liking, subscribing and hitting the bell as it helps out the channel a lot. So thanks for that, and let's get to the build. So for the skill tree, we're going to start off with 5 into Lash. And then we're going to go for Glinting Lash. Then in our core skills, we're going to take 1 into Charged Bolts and go for the Destructive Charged Bolts. In our defensive skills, we're taking 1 into Flame Shield, 5 into Teleport, go for Shimmering Teleport, 3 into Glass Cannon, 1 into Elemental Attunement, 1 into Ice Armor, and go for the Mystical Ice Armor. In our Conjuration skills, we're going for 1 in Ice Blades, go for Summoned Ice Blades, 1 in Lightning Spear, and go for Invoked Lightning Spear. We're also taking 3 into Conjuration Mastery, 1 into Align the Elements, and 3 into Protection. In our Mastery skills, we're taking 2 into Icy Veil, 1 into Inner Flames to get the 3 in Devouring Blaze. Then we're going to go for 1 into Static Discharge to get the 3 in Shocking Impact. In our ultimate skills, we're taking Unstable Currents with Prime Unstable Currents. We're going to take Coursing Currents, 1 point, and 3 points into Electrocution, and 3 points into Convulsions. And for our key passive, we're going to take the Veer's Mastery. Next up we have the Paragon Board. So for the Paragon Board, we're going to use an 8 glyph board here. And for the starting board, we're going to start off with the Reinforced glyph for the extra damage reduction whilst having an active barrier. In our second board, we're going to have the Enchantment Master board, and we're going for the Elementalist glyph, so dealing fire, cold or lightning damage, increases all damage we deal to enemies by 5% for 10 seconds, stacking once per element. For our third board, we're going to be taking the Burning Instinct board, and for the glyph, we're going to use our Tactician glyph here. So we deal 10% increased damage for 4 seconds after casting a defensive skill, and this duration is increased by 4 seconds for each defensive skill not on our action bar. Also make sure to get the Safeguard rare node here. For our fourth board, we're going for the Ceaseless Conduit board, and we're going to put in the Destruction glyph for the critical strike damage. Also, critical strikes increase all damage the enemy takes from us by 2% for 10 seconds, up to 12%. For our fifth board, we're going for the Searing Heat board, and we're going to put in the Exploit glyph for that vulnerable damage, as well as dealing damage to a vulnerable enemy increases our damage by 1% for 6 seconds, up to 10%. For our sixth board, we're going for the Static Surge board, and we're going to put in the Control glyph here for that extra damage to CC'd enemies. So we deal 10% increased damage to slowed or chilled enemies, or 20% to stunned or frozen enemies. For our seventh board, we're going for the Frigid Fate board, making sure we take the legendary node. And for the glyph, we're using Flame Feeder for the damage to burning enemies. Also, we will deal 10% increased direct damage to burning enemies. And for our final board, we're going to take the Icefall board. And for the glyph, we're using Territorial for that damage reduction against close enemies and damage to close enemies. So that pretty much wraps up the board. Nice and simple. All of this is going to be in the build planner in the description below, as usual, along with the gear, the enchantments, the skill tree, and everything else. So make sure to check that out if I went too fast for you, and you can go over it in detail there. Next up, for the enchantments, we're taking Ice Blades as our first enchantment. So for every 40 seconds in cooldowns we spend, we spawn an Ice Blades on a random enemy, and we also get the modifiers. And for our second enchantment, we're using the Firebolt enchantment, so direct damage from skills applies up to an additional 40% burning damage over 8 seconds. That's going to allow us to use our Devouring Blaze passive, and also our Flame Feeder glyph. Next up, we have the gear. So on the left I'm going to be listing the affixes and the tempering you want for each item. We're going to start with the Helm. We're going for a Harlequin crest here. It's going to give us all stats, max life, resource generation and cooldown reduction. Also we gain 20% damage reduction, in addition gain 4 ranks to all skills. If you don't have access to a Harlequin crest, then you could use a Godslayer crown here, so it gives us max life, damage, CC duration and cooldown reduction. Also when you stun, freeze or immobilize an elite enemy or damage a boss, it pulls in nearby enemies and you deal 30 to 60% increased damage to them for 3 seconds, occurring once every 12 seconds. If you don't have access to a Godslayer crown either, you would use a helm with intelligence, cooldown reduction and max life. You would temper that with max life and lucky hit percent chance to freeze. As for the aspect, you would want to use the aspect of Everliving here, so you take 10 to 25% less damage from CC'd or vulnerable enemies. As for the masterworking, for all 3 of the helms, you would want to masterwork the cooldown reduction. Next up we have the Chestpiece. We're going to use a Raiment here, so that gives us intelligence, damage to close, and damage to stunned, as well as a rank into glass cannon. So after using teleport, close enemies are pulled to us and stunned for 2 to 3 seconds, but teleport's cooldown is increased by 20%, and that is the aspect for the Raiment. For the masterworking, you would want to masterwork the damage to close enemies. If you don't have access to a Raiment, use a Chestpiece with intelligence, defensive skills, and max life. As for the tempering, you would temper that with max life and lucky hit percent chance to slow. And for the aspect, you would want to use the aspect of the Mage-Lord. So Veer's Mastery Key passive also grants 6 to 9% damage reduction, tripled while fighting a close enemy. And for the masterworking, you would want to masterwork the defensive skills. Next up we have the gloves. We're going to be using the Paingorger's gauntlets here. This is mandatory for the build. I wouldn't try this without it. We get all stats, attack speed, crit chance, and basic damage with these gloves, but also damaging enemies with a non-basic skill cast marks them for 3 seconds. When a basic skill first hits a marked enemy, the damage is echoed to all marked enemies, dealing 100 to 200% increased damage. So this is the main source of our AoE damage. So like I said, you wouldn't want to try this build without these gloves. And for the masterworking, we want to masterwork the basic damage. Next up we have the legs. We're going to go for some normal pants here with ranks into basic skills or Arc Lash, preferably Arc Lash, intelligence and max life. We're going to temper this with total armor and lucky hit percent chance to stun. As for the aspect, we're going to use the aspect of concussive strikes here. So damaging an enemy has up to a 20% chance to daze them for 2 seconds. And we also deal 5 to 20% increased damage to dazed enemies. For the masterworking, we're going to try to masterwork the ranks into Arc Lash / basic skills. If you want a more tanky version of the build, you would use Mage-Lords here. Next up we have the boots. We're going to be using some normal boots here. Try and get the attacks reduce evades cooldown perk for the innate trait. For the affixes, we're going to look for intelligence, max life, and armor. As for the tempering, we're going to temper it with cooldown reduction for teleport, and lucky hit percent chance to immobilize. For the aspect, we're going for the hectic aspect. After casting 5 basic skills, one of your active cooldowns is reduced by 1 to 2 seconds. For the masterworking, we're going to try and masterwork the intelligence here. Next up we have the main hand. We're going to look for a dagger here, and we're going to look for intelligence, damage, and vulnerable damage as the affixes. We're going to try and temper this with damage to close enemies, and chance to deal poison damage on lucky hit. For the aspect, we're going to go with Conceited, so we deal 10 to 25% increased damage while we have a barrier active. As for the masterworking, we're going to try and masterwork the vulnerable damage. Next up we have the offhand. We're going to be looking for something with crit chance, cooldown reduction, and intelligence, and we're going to temper this with damage to close enemies and teleport Nova size. Now that's interchangeable with the main hand, only one of them needs the chance to deal poison damage, the other one will have the teleport nova size. As for the aspect, we're going to be using Storm Swell here, so we deal 15 to 30% increased damage to vulnerable enemies while we have a barrier. The other option here is the rapid aspect, so basic skills gain 15 to 30% attack speed. As for the masterworking, you're going to try and masterwork the crit strike chance. Next up we have the Amulet. We're going to be looking for something with crit chance, cooldown reduction and attack speed. We're going to temper it with unstable currents, cooldown reduction and damage to close enemies. For the aspect, we're going to be using the aspect of adaptability. So when cast at or above 50% maximum resource, which is always with this build, basic skills deal 30 to 120% increased damage. As for the masterworking, we're going to try and masterwork the attack speed here. Next up we have the rings. We're going for Tal Rasha's Iridescent Loop as our first ring. Gives us non-physical damage, lucky hit chance, and cooldown reduction. Also for each type of elemental damage we deal, we gain 10 to 15% increased damage for 4 seconds, up to 40 to 60%, and dealing any elemental damage refreshes all bonuses. And we're going to try and masterwork the non-physical damage here. For our secondary ring, we're going to use something with intelligence, attack speed, and critical strike chance. You could also use critical strike damage instead of intelligence. And we're going to temper that with unstable currents, cooldown reduction, and damage to close enemies. As for the aspect, we're going to use the aspect of the Moonrise here. So damaging an enemy with a basic skill grants us 4% attack speed for 10 seconds, stacking up to 5 times, and upon reaching max stacks, you enter a Vampiric Blood Rage and gain 40 to 80% increased basic skill damage, and gain 15% movement speed for 10 seconds. So for the masterworking, we're going to try and masterwork the attack speed here as well. If you don't have access to the Tal Rashas, you would basically want to use a duplicate of this ring, and for the aspect you would use whichever one you weren't using for your offhand, so either Storm Swell or Rapid. That pretty much wraps it up for the gear. For the gems, we're using 2 diamonds and 1 skull in the jewellery, the yellow gems in the offhand and main hand, which is going to give us our basic damage, and the red gems in the armour, which is the maximum life. That wraps it up for the build. If you enjoyed or just happened to make it this far, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell as it helps out the channel a lot, and I would really appreciate it. Pretty much nothing else left to say about it. I hope you give it a try and enjoy it, and I'll leave you with some more arc lashing. Thanks again for watching, and hope you have a great day. Bye!